Private James Carter sat ramrod straight in the defendant's chair, his dress uniform perfectly pressed. His boots shined to a mirror finish. But none of that mattered now. The three colonels sitting behind the elevated judge's bench looked at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to barely concealed disgust. He was 22 years old, fresh out of infantry training, with exactly 7 months of active duty under his belt. And he was about to be kicked out of the army for the most serious offense a soldier could commit, willfully disobeying a direct order in a combat zone. The military courtroom at Fort Benning, Georgia, was packed. Word had spread quickly through the base about the young private who had committed what many were calling career suicide. Other soldiers came to watch, some out of curiosity, others to witness what they believed would be a cautionary tale about the importance of following the chain of command. Captain David Morrison sat in the front row of the gallery, his jaw clenched tight, his hands folded so firmly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. He had been Carter's commanding officer in Afghanistan. He had given the order that Carter disobeyed, and now he refused to even glance in the young private's direction. The prosecuting attorney, a stern-faced major named Patricia Hendricks, stood and approached the tribunal. Her voice was crisp and authoritative as she laid out the charges. On September 14, 2009, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, Private First Class James Carter willfully and deliberately disobeyed a direct order from his superior officer, Captain David Morrison. This order was given during an active combat operation involving a convoy of 47 vehicles and approximately 400 United States Army personnel. She paused, letting the weight of those numbers sink in. For 100 lives, for 100 soldiers whose safety depended on following established protocols and obeying commands without question. Private Carter was the lead driver in this convoy, Major Hendricks continued. His job was simple: follow Route Alpha as ordered by Captain Morrison. This route had been cleared by military intelligence, approved by command, and designated as the safest passage to forward operating Base Titan. She turned to look at Carter, her expression hard. Instead, Private Carter made an unauthorized turn onto Route Bravo, a road that had not been cleared, had not been approved, and was potentially filled with improvised explosive devices and enemy combatants. He forced the entire convoy to follow him into unknown danger. The room was silent except for the quiet whir of the ceiling fan. Carter kept his eyes forward, his expression carefully neutral, even as he felt the weight of 400 pairs of invisible eyes judging him. The military cannot function without discipline, Major Hendricks said, her voice rising slightly. Every soldier, from private to general, must follow orders. The moment we allow personal judgment to override command decisions, we put lives at risk. We create chaos where there should be order. She walked back to her table and picked up a thick folder. Private Carter's defense will claim he had a feeling that Route Alpha was dangerous. A feeling, not intelligence, not reconnaissance, not any concrete evidence. Just a gut instinct from a soldier who had been in country for less than 3 months. The lead colonel on the tribunal, a silver-haired veteran named Colonel Thomas Bradford, leaned forward. Major Hendricks, I assume you have Captain Morrison's testimony? Yes, sir. Captain Morrison has provided a detailed written statement. However, she paused, and something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or confusion. Captain Morrison has declined to testify in person. A murmur ran through the courtroom. It was unusual for a commanding officer not to testify in person at a court-martial involving one of his soldiers, especially in a case this serious. Colonel Bradford frowned. Has Captain Morrison provided a reason for his absence? He cited personal reasons, sir. He is currently on extended leave. Carter's defense attorney, a young captain named Robert Chun, stood up. If I may, Colonel Bradford, we find it highly irregular that the officer who gave the order in question refuses to face my client in this courtroom. Noted, Captain Chun, Bradford replied. But we will proceed with the written testimony. Major Hendricks, continue. The prosecution spent the next hour laying out the case in meticulous detail. They presented maps showing Route Alpha and Route Bravo. They showed the planned timeline versus the actual timeline. They read excerpts from Captain Morrison's statement describing how he had clearly and unambiguously ordered the convoy to take Route Alpha. Through it all, Carter sat perfectly still, his mind drifting back to that scorching September afternoon in Afghanistan. He remembered every detail with crystal clarity. The way the dust hung in the air like a curtain, the smell of diesel fuel and sweat, the weight of his rifle across his lap as he sat in the driver's seat of the lead Humvee. And he remembered the feeling, that terrible, gnawing certainty that something was wrong. September 14, 2009. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The pre-dawn briefing had been routine. Captain Morrison stood in front of a map, pointing out the route with a laser pointer, while 47 vehicle commanders listened and took notes. "We depart at 0600 hours, Morrison had said, his voice carrying the confidence of an officer who had run dozens of these convoy operations. "Route Alpha is clear. Intelligence confirmed it yesterday. No IED activity, no enemy movement. It's a straight shot, 12 kilometers, and we'll be at FOB Titan by 1430 hours. Private James Carter had sat in the back of the tent, listening carefully. He was the youngest soldier in the room, the least experienced, the one everyone expected to simply do what he was told and stay out of the way. His job was to drive the lead vehicle and follow directions. Nothing more. But even then, during that briefing, something had felt off. He couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for his unease. The intelligence was solid. The route was approved. Captain Morrison was an experienced officer who had successfully led countless convoys through far more dangerous territory. And yet, now, 6 hours later, Carter sat behind the wheel of his Humvee at the front of a convoy that stretched nearly half a mile behind him. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez sat in the passenger seat, checking his rifle for the third time. In the back, 2 more soldiers scanned the terrain through the armored windows. "Lead vehicle, this is Convoy 6. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. "You are approaching the junction. Maintain course on Route Alpha. Acknowledge." Carter stared at the dusty road ahead. In less than 200 meters, the road would split. Left was Route Alpha, the approved route. Right was Route Bravo, which would add 6 kilometers and 45 minutes to their journey. "Lead vehicle acknowledges." Rodriguez replied into the radio, then glanced at Carter. "You hear that, kid? Left turn coming up. Nice and easy." Carter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The feeling in his gut had been growing stronger with every kilometer they traveled. It was like a voice in his head, screaming at him to stop, to think, to look closer. But at what? The road ahead looked exactly like every other road they had traveled. Dirt and rocks and dust. No visible threats. No signs of disturbance. "Carter," Rodriguez said, noticing the private's hesitation. "You okay?" "Something's wrong, Sergeant," Carter said quietly. Rodriguez stiffened. "What do you mean? You see something?" "No, I don't know. I just have this feeling that we shouldn't take Alpha." The sergeant's expression hardened. "A feeling? Carter, we don't make tactical decisions based on feelings. We have intelligence, we have orders, and we have a job to do." "I know, Sergeant, but..." "Lead vehicle junction in 100 meters. Morrison's voice cut through the radio. "Maintain Route Alpha." Carter's heart was pounding now. The junction was getting closer. 50 meters. 40. 30. He thought about his training. About the countless hours of being told that the chain of command existed for a reason. That soldiers who think they know better than their officers get people killed. That discipline and obedience were the foundation of military effectiveness. 20 meters. But he also thought about something his instructor had said during a survival training exercise back at Fort Benning. The instructor, a grizzled veteran with 3 combat tours, had looked the trainees in the eye and said, "Your brain can be fooled. Your eyes can be deceived. But your gut knows things your conscious mind hasn't figured out yet. When that voice in your head screams at you, you better damn well listen." 10 meters. Carter made his decision. He turned the wheel to the right. The Humvee lurched onto Route Bravo. For a moment, there was stunned silence on the radio. Then all hell broke loose. "Lead vehicle, what the hell are you doing?" Morrison's voice exploded through the speakers. You just missed your turn. Get back on Alpha now. Rodriguez grabbed Carter's shoulder. Carter, turn around. That's a direct order. Behind them, the entire convoy had followed Carter's turn. 47 vehicles, all committed to Route Bravo because the lead vehicle had chosen it. Lead vehicle, this is Convoy 6. You are in direct violation of my orders. Turn this convoy around immediately. Carter's voice was surprisingly calm when he spoke into his radio headset. Sir, I respectfully request permission to continue on Bravo. Permission denied. Private, you turn this convoy around right now or I will have you arrested for insubordination the moment we reach base. Rodriguez stared at Carter in disbelief. The two soldiers in the back had gone completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing something that could end careers, or worse. Carter took a deep breath. Sir, I cannot comply with that order. The radio went silent. When Morrison's voice came back, it was cold and controlled. Private First Class James Carter, you are hereby officially in violation of military code. Continue on your current course, but understand that you will face a court-martial for this decision. Convoy 6 out. The Humvee rumbled down Route Bravo, kicking up clouds of dust in its wake. Rodriguez had turned to look out the window, his jaw clenched, clearly wrestling with whether he should physically intervene and take control of the vehicle. Sergeant, Carter said quietly, I'm sorry. I know this ends my career, but I couldn't take us down Alpha. Something is wrong with that road. You better pray you're right, kid, Rodriguez muttered. Because if you're wrong, you just destroyed your life for nothing. The convoy continued down Route Bravo in tense silence. The road was rougher than Alpha would have been, winding through slightly more elevated terrain that added both time and difficulty to the journey. Every soldier in every vehicle knew what had just happened. The lead driver had defied a direct order. The consequences would be severe. They reached FOB Titan 45 minutes later than planned, exhausted and covered in dust. The moment the convoy pulled through the gates, Carter was immediately arrested by military police. They confiscated his rifle and sidearm, placed him in restraints, and escorted him to a detention cell. Captain Morrison arrived at his Humvee within minutes, his face purple with rage. He stormed past other soldiers, heading straight for the detention facility where Carter was being held. Through the small window in his cell door, Carter could hear Morrison's voice echoing down the corridor. That private just committed the most blatant act of insubordination I've seen in 15 years of service. I want him charged with everything the military code allows. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood outside Carter's cell, his expression unreadable. You realize what you've done, don't you? He said quietly. Even if you were right about something being wrong with Alpha, you still disobeyed a direct order in a combat zone. There's no coming back from that. Carter nodded slowly. I know, Sergeant, but I couldn't take 400 soldiers down a road that felt wrong. Felt wrong, Rodriguez repeated, shaking his head. Kid, the military doesn't run on feelings. For the next 3 days, Carter sat in detention while the paperwork was prepared for his court-martial. Other soldiers whispered about him as they passed. Some called him a coward. Others called him crazy. A few wondered aloud if he might actually have been right. But those voices were quickly silenced by the weight of military discipline. On the morning of the 4th day, Carter was woken by the sound of urgent voices outside his cell. He sat up on his narrow bunk as the door opened and a major he didn't recognize entered, accompanied by 2 lieutenants and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. The major's expression was grave. Private Carter, I'm Major William Foster from Military Intelligence. I need you to come with me immediately. Carter stood, confused. Sir, I'm scheduled for court-martial proceedings. Those proceedings are being postponed, Foster interrupted. Something has happened that requires your immediate attention. They led him out of the detention facility and across the base to the Intelligence Operations Center. Inside, a large screen dominated one wall, displaying a satellite image of the terrain around FOB Titan. Captain Morrison was already there, standing very still, his face pale. Major Foster pointed to the screen. This imagery was taken by a military satellite 3 hours ago, as part of a routine sweep of the region. He zoomed in on the image, focusing on a section of road. Route Alpha. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The entire road was lined with IEDs. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, buried at precise intervals along the entire 12-kilometer stretch. The satellite's advanced imaging technology had detected the metallic signatures of the explosive devices hidden just beneath the surface of the dirt road. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Major Foster's voice was quiet but firm. "Our intelligence teams have analyzed the placement patterns. These IEDs were positioned within the 48 hours before your convoy departed. They were specifically placed to target a large military convoy. Based on the spacing and the estimated blast radius of each device, if your convoy had proceeded down Route Alpha as ordered." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room could do the math. 400 soldiers, 47 vehicles, dozens of IEDs designed to create a kill zone. The casualties would have been catastrophic. Captain Morrison had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. "How did our intelligence miss this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We're still investigating that, sir," Major Foster replied. "But what matters right now is that Private Carter's decision to disobey your order and take Route Bravo saved every life in that convoy." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Carter, who stood near the door, still in his detention uniform, still technically under arrest for the very decision that had just been revealed as the right one. Rodriguez walked over to Carter, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "How did you know, kid? How the hell did you know?" Carter shook his head slowly. "I didn't know, Sergeant. I felt it. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now. I just knew we couldn't take that road." Major Foster studied Carter intently. "Private, in my 20 years of military intelligence work, I've seen soldiers develop what we call threat intuition. It's a subconscious processing of environmental cues that the conscious mind doesn't register. You might have noticed something about Route Alpha during the briefing or the approach, something too subtle to articulate, but real enough to trigger your survival instincts. Or," Rodriguez added quietly, "maybe he's just the luckiest son of a bitch in the entire army." Captain Morrison finally looked up at Carter. His eyes were red-rimmed, and when he spoke, his voice cracked. "Private Carter, I owe you an apology. I owe every soldier in that convoy an apology. You saved our lives, and I tried to destroy your career for it." Carter stood at attention. "Sir, you were following protocol. You had intelligence that indicated Alpha was safe. You made the right decision based on the information you had. But you made a better one," Morrison replied. "You trusted something that military doctrine says shouldn't be trusted, and you were willing to sacrifice everything to protect soldiers you barely knew." Over the next several days, the investigation into the IED placement expanded. Intelligence teams discovered that a Taliban cell had obtained information about the convoy's route and timing through a compromised local informant. They had worked through the night to plant the explosives, confident that American forces would follow their standard protocol and take the shortest, most direct route. What they hadn't counted on was a 22-year-old private with an unexplainable gut instinct. The military courtroom at Fort Benning, Georgia. Present day. Major Hendricks stood before the tribunal, but now her expression had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like reluctant respect. "The prosecution," she said slowly, "acknowledges that subsequent events have complicated this case significantly." Colonel Bradford leaned forward. "Complicated, Major? That's an interesting word choice." "Sir, the prosecution cannot ignore the fact that Private Carter's decision, while technically insubordinate, resulted in saving approximately 400 American lives." The courtroom erupted in whispers. This was the first time anyone outside the intelligence community had heard the full story. Captain Chun, Carter's defense attorney, stood up. "Colonel Bradford, I would like to introduce new evidence into these proceedings." He approached with a folder containing the satellite imagery and intelligence reports. The three colonels studied the documents in silence, their expressions growing more grave with each page they turned. Finally, Colonel Bradford looked up at Carter. "Private Carter, please stand." Carter rose from his chair, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was about to happen. The evidence clearly showed he had made the right decision, but he had still violated military law. The tribunal had to balance justice against the absolute necessity of military discipline. "Private Carter," Bradford said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "what you did on September 14, 2009, was inexcusable." Carter's heart sank. "You disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer. You violated the chain of command. You placed your personal judgment above military intelligence and established protocol." Bradford paused, letting his words sink in. "And in doing so," he continued, his voice softening slightly, "you saved 400 lives. You prevented what would have been one of the deadliest attacks on American forces in the Afghanistan conflict. You demonstrated courage, conviction, and a willingness to sacrifice your career for the lives of your fellow soldiers." The colonel looked at his two fellow tribunal members, who both nodded. "This tribunal finds that while your actions were technically in violation of military code, they were also extraordinarily heroic. We are dismissing all charges against you, Private First Class Carter." The courtroom exploded with noise. Soldiers who had come to watch a disgrace were now witnessing a vindication. But Bradford wasn't finished. He held up his hand for silence. "Furthermore, it is the recommendation of this tribunal that Private Carter be considered for commendation for his actions. We are forwarding this case to the Pentagon with a strong recommendation that he receive recognition for preventing a catastrophic loss of American lives." Carter stood in shock, barely processing the words he was hearing. It was over. He wasn't going to prison. He wasn't being kicked out of the army, he was being called a hero. Captain Chen approached and shook his hand firmly. "Congratulations, Private. You just made legal history." As the courtroom began to clear, Carter noticed Captain Morrison standing near the back. The officer who had refused to testify, who had tried to have him court-martialed, who had been so certain that Carter had endangered the convoy. Morrison walked forward slowly, and when he reached Carter, he stood at attention and saluted Carter, stunned, returned the salute. "Private Carter," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "I couldn't testify because I couldn't stand in front of a tribunal and argue for your punishment when you saved my life and the lives of every soldier under my command. I wrote that statement during the first hours after your arrest, when I was angry and humiliated that a private had overruled my decision. But I couldn't speak those words out loud once I knew the truth." He extended his hand. "Thank you for having the courage to disobey me. Thank you for trusting yourself when no one else did." Carter shook his hand, emotion overwhelming him. "Sir, you trained us to stay alert, to trust our instincts. I was just following your teaching." Morrison smiled sadly. "No, Private. You were following something deeper than training. Something that can't be taught." 6 months later, Private First Class James Carter was promoted to specialist. He remained in the Army for another 6 years, serving with distinction. But he never forgot that September afternoon when he turned right instead of left. The incident became a case study at West Point, where it sparked intense debates about the balance between military discipline and individual judgment. New training protocols were developed to help soldiers recognize the difference between fear-based hesitation and genuine threat intuition. Captain Morrison also remained in the military, eventually being promoted to major. But he never commanded another convoy without remembering the young private who saved his life by disobeying his orders. The Taliban cell responsible for planting the IEDs was eventually located and eliminated. When interrogated, the cell leader expressed confusion about why the American convoy hadn't taken Route Alpha. "We had perfect intelligence," he insisted. "They should have driven right into our trap." What he didn't understand was that military perfection could be defeated by something as simple and inexplicable as one soldier's gut instinct. Years later, when Carter finally left the Army and returned to civilian life, he was often asked about that day. How did he know? What made him turn right instead of left? His answer was always the same: "I didn't know. I just couldn't ignore what I was feeling. And I decided that if I was going to ruin my career, I'd rather ruin it trying to save lives than following an order that felt wrong." It was a lesson that transcended military service. Sometimes the right decision isn't the one that follows protocol. Sometimes the right decision is the one that requires you to risk everything based on nothing more than certainty in your heart. Sometimes disobedience isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the purest form of courage. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a decision that went against what everyone expected of you? Have you ever trusted your instincts when logic said you were wrong? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who needs the courage to trust themselves. And if the story moved you, if it reminded you that courage sometimes means standing alone, hit that subscribe button. These stories deserve to be told, and these heroes deserve to be remembered.